The morning started like any other in Ethan's peaceful little apiary. The soft hum of bees usually brought him comfort, but today, something was off. The buzzing wasn't gentle, it was frantic. His heart pounded as he stepped into his honey shack, and his worst fear was confirmed. The wooden shelves, once filled with jars of golden honey, were nearly empty. Only a few sticky smudges and an overturned lid remained. He barely had time to process the loss before spotting the culprit. Linda, his self-entitled neighbor, was casually loading his stolen honey into the back of her luxury SUV, acting like she had just returned from a grocery run. She even had the audacity to lick a drop off the lid and smirk, as if savoring her victory. Ethan's fists clenched. A dozen thoughts raced through his mind. Call the police, confront her, or teach her a lesson she'd never forget. Linda had been a nightmare ever since she moved in. She borrowed things without returning them, threw wild parties, and once even knocked over one of his beehives, forcing him to calm an angry swarm for hours. But this was war. Ethan stormed back inside, his anger simmering into something sharper, something strategic. Linda had always been a selfish, entitled nuisance, but today she had crossed a line. His honey wasn't just a hobby, it was his livelihood, his passion, his pride. If she wanted honey so badly, then fine, he'd make sure she got more than she bargained for. He glanced over at his beehives. His bees were restless, their usual gentle buzzing laced with irritation. It was as if they knew something had been taken from them. That gave him an idea, a brilliant, ironic, slightly evil idea. Ethan walked to his workbench and reached for a special jar, one infused with a unique blend of natural pheromones. Normally, he used it to help guide lost bees back to their hive. But today, it had a new purpose. That night, Ethan barely slept, excitement bubbling inside him. He kept picturing Linda's face when she realized what was happening. The slow, dawning horror as she found herself the prime target of an unrelenting swarm. The next morning, he set his trap. He left one jar of honey on the very shelf where Linda had stolen from before. He didn't even bother hiding it. If there was one thing predictable about Linda, it was her greed. And sure enough, by noon, she struck again. Ethan sat on his porch, sipping tea, waiting. An hour later, it happened. A high-pitched scream pierced the quiet morning air. He calmly set his cup down and strolled to the fence, peeking over. There she was, Linda flailing wildly in her backyard, her meticulously arranged brunch descending into complete and utter chaos. At first, just a few bees arrived, drawn by the pheromone-infused honey. Then, as if summoned by the universe itself, more began to appear. Dozens, then hundreds. Linda screamed. Her guests scattered in terror. Someone dove into the pool with a splash. Another tripped over a chair and tumbled into a hedge. Plates shattered, drinks spilled, napkins flew into the air. Linda, meanwhile, was running in circles, waving her arms, making everything worse. She tried to swat them away. A terrible mistake. The bees, now fully engaged, chased her relentlessly. Ethan took a sip of his tea, watching the scene unfold like a perfectly executed play. It was karma in its purest form. And the best part? This was just the beginning. He knew Linda wouldn't back down. She was the type to blame everyone but herself. She'd seek revenge, which meant Ethan had to be 2 steps ahead. And fortunately for him, he was more than ready. Ethan knew Linda too well to believe that this was over. If anything, this was only the beginning. Sure enough, the very next day, as Ethan tended to his beehives, He overheard Linda ranting on the phone from her backyard. "I don't know what happened. 1 second, everything was fine. And then bam! Suddenly I was being attacked by 1,000,000 bees. And now I have to cancel my spa appointment because my arms are covered in sting marks." Ethan smirked to himself. Oh, Linda. Still playing the victim, huh? But then, her next words piqued his interest. "I'll tell you what, though. That honey? Totally worth it. I don't care what happened, I'm getting more." Ethan nearly dropped his beekeeping tool. She had learned nothing. Unbelievable. That's when he decided round 2 was coming. That night, he made a new batch of special honey. But this time, he wasn't just using pheromones. No, this one was a perfected blend. A mix designed to make Linda the most interesting person in any area with bees. He placed the jar right where she could find it, and just like clockwork, she took the bait. Ethan watched from his upstairs window as Linda snuck into his yard, moving quickly but clumsily, stuffing the jar into her oversized designer purse. "Gotcha," Ethan whispered, grinning. But this time, Linda didn't just steal the honey. She flaunted it. The next morning, as Ethan sipped his coffee on his porch, he heard Linda bragging loudly to a friend on the phone. "Oh yeah, I got my hands on some more of that honey. This time I made sure to take enough for everyone. I'm hosting another brunch tomorrow, and let me tell you, it's going to be perfect." Ethan chuckled. "Perfect? Oh, Linda, you have no idea." The morning of the brunch, Ethan made sure to be outside, tending to his hives, fully visible. He wanted a front-row seat to the chaos about to unfold. Linda had set up an extravagant backyard spread, elegant table settings, ridiculous flower arrangements, and a guest list full of people who didn't actually like each other, but pretended to for social status. And front and center? The stolen honey, drizzled over pastries, mixed into drinks, showcased like a trophy. For a few minutes, everything seemed fine. And then, the bees arrived. At first, no one noticed the bees. A few buzzed around the fruit platter. One landed briefly on the rim of a mimosa. A guest absent-mindedly swatted at another hovering near a pastry. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a few stray insects. But then more arrived. 5, 10, 20. Within minutes, the air hummed with a growing swarm. Linda, ever the queen of denial, kept smiling through clenched teeth. She waved a dismissive hand. "Ugh, it's just a couple of bees. Relax, everyone." But the bees weren't leaving. They ignored the food, ignored the guests. They only wanted one thing: Linda. The pheromones Ethan had infused into the honey had worked flawlessly. To the bees, Linda wasn't just an interesting visitor. She was their queen. One landed on her shoulder, another in her hair. A third crawled along her sleeve. She froze. Her forced smile twitched. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple. Then, one brushed against her cheek. And that was it. Linda, completely, lost it. She let out a blood-curdling scream and flung herself backward, knocking over a towering display of pastries. The elegant brunch table tipped over, sending plates and glasses crashing onto the grass. Guests screamed, chairs toppled. Someone shrieked, "They're attacking us!" even though the bees were only chasing Linda. A man dove into the pool, making a dramatic slow-motion splash. A woman tripped over a flower pot and tumbled straight into the hedges. Linda? She ran. Arms flailing, she tore across her backyard, shrieking like a horror movie protagonist. She knocked over a drink cart, sending bottles flying. She grabbed a napkin and frantically swatted at her own head, only making things worse. But the bees? They were relentless. Every time she tried to escape, they followed. Every step she took, they matched. It was a perfect, poetic disaster. Ethan leaned casually against his fence, sipping his tea, watching the chaos unfold like a director admiring his masterpiece. Linda finally dove through her back door, slamming it shut behind her. For a moment, silence. Then, a muffled crash. A thud. Another scream. Ethan nearly choked on his tea from laughter. She had forgotten that bees don't care about doors. The brunch was over. Guests scattered like survivors of a battlefield, their once pristine outfits ruined. And Linda? Well, she was learning a lesson. But Ethan knew it wasn't over yet. Linda never admitted defeat. She would come back. And when she did, he'd be ready. Ethan expected a furious confrontation the next morning. That was Linda's style. Always playing the victim, always making a scene. But surprisingly, her house remained silent. No screaming, no demands, no threats. For the first time since she moved in, Linda wasn't trying to be the center of attention. At first, Ethan thought she had finally learned her lesson. He was wrong. 3 days later, as he was tending to his beehives, he found an envelope taped to his front door. The moment he saw the fancy embossed lettering, he knew. Nobody sends good news in an envelope that expensive. With a sigh, he tore it open, and there it was. A lawsuit. Linda was suing him for emotional distress, negligence, and damages. Ethan had to read it twice just to be sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. This woman, who had stolen from him, trespassed on his property, and caused her own disaster, was now trying to drag him into court over bees. He let out a slow breath, resisting the overwhelming urge to laugh. Classic Linda. When she couldn't win, she whined. When she couldn't control the situation, she turned it into a spectacle. And now, she was trying to flip the narrative, painting herself as the innocent victim of a bee attack. But there was one problem with her plan. Linda always underestimated people. She assumed everyone was either too weak, too stupid, or too afraid to fight back. And that was her biggest mistake. Ethan grabbed his phone and called his lawyer, Lisa, a no-nonsense woman with the patience of a saint and the bite of a wolf. She listened to the details, sighed, and said exactly what Ethan wanted to hear. She doesn't have a case. If anything, you do. Ethan grinned. Let's do this. A week later, Ethan sat in a small courtroom, watching Linda put on the performance of a lifetime, wearing a ridiculous neck brace that Ethan was 99% sure was fake. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, voice trembling as she recounted her trauma. They chased me. I couldn't escape. It was a nightmare, she wailed. The judge, a tired-looking man who had clearly seen his fair share of ridiculous cases, sighed and turned to Ethan. Do you have a response to these allegations? Ethan stood up, smiled. Yes, Your Honor. I have security footage. Linda's face went pale. Oh, this was going to be good. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Linda's fake sobbing halted mid-sniffle. Her fingers tightened around her tissue as if she could somehow will away the evidence. Ethan handed the USB drive to the bailiff. Seconds later, the security footage began playing on the courtroom monitor. First, the video showed Linda sneaking into Ethan's backyard, rummaging through his shelves and stuffing jars of honey into her oversized purse. Then came the brunch disaster. The courtroom watched as Linda screamed, flailed, and sprinted through her yard while her guests toppled furniture, dove into pools, and tripped over each other in sheer panic. It was pure, high-definition chaos, And the best part? The bees weren't attacking. They weren't aggressive. They weren't even stinging. They were just there, attracted to the pheromone-infused honey that Linda had stolen. When the video ended, the judge let out a long, exhausted sigh and turned to Linda. "Miss Linda, I have a few questions." She swallowed hard. Yes, Your Honor?" "Did you, or did you not, steal honey from the defendant?" Linda's mouth opened, then closed. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her brain scrambling for an excuse. The judge raised an eyebrow. "I'll take that as a yes." Linda's face burned red. "And did the defendant at any point send the bees to attack you?" Well, I mean..." The judge leaned forward. "Miss Linda." She deflated like a balloon. "No, Your Honor." The judge shuffled his papers. "I'm dismissing this case, and I strongly advise you to stay off your neighbor's property unless you want to be dealing with real legal trouble." Linda looked like she wanted to sink through the floor. She let out a furious huff, grabbed her designer bag, and stormed out of the courtroom. Lisa, Ethan's lawyer, smirked. "Well, that was satisfying." Ethan chuckled. Beyond satisfying. As he walked out of the courthouse, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. Not just because he had won, but because Linda had finally faced real consequences for her actions. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about pettiness. It was about standing his ground. And now? Linda would think twice before stealing from him again. At least Ethan hoped so. A few days later, Ethan was outside tending to his beehives when he noticed Linda standing by her car. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't marching over with another ridiculous complaint. She was just standing there. For a split second, Ethan thought, maybe, just maybe, she's going to apologize. But then she scoffed, spun on her heel, and stormed inside. Ethan smirked. Some people never learn. But for once, Linda wasn't bothering him. No more sneaking into his yard, no more smug comments, no more stolen honey. She didn't even try her usual passive-aggressive remarks about his garden being an eyesore. In fact, she barely left her house at all. And when she did, she constantly glanced over her shoulder, like she expected the bees to ambush her at any moment. Ethan couldn't have asked for a better outcome. Some battles weren't won with shouting matches. Some lessons weren't taught with anger. Sometimes, poetic justice did all the work for you. Ethan took a deep breath, listening to the gentle hum of his bees, a satisfied smile on his face. His honey was safe. His bees were happy. And best of all, Linda was finally out of his life. But just in case, he still had plenty of special honey, if she ever needed another lesson. Ethan's story teaches us a simple but powerful truth. Some people think they can take whatever they want without consequences, but karma always finds a way. Linda believed she was above the rules. She stole, she lied, and she never once considered the impact of her actions. But in the end, she wasn't untouchable. Ethan could have argued, yelled, or even called the cops. But instead, he chose patience, strategy, and a little poetic justice. And that's the key takeaway. Not every battle is fought with fists or words. Sometimes, the best way to handle toxic, entitled people is to let their own actions come back to bite them. Because the truth is, people like Linda don't change because you tell them to. They change when they realize the world won't let them get away with their behavior anymore. So the next time someone disrespects your boundaries, takes advantage of you, or refuses to learn a lesson, remember Ethan's story, because sometimes the best revenge is just letting karma do its thing. We've all dealt with a Linda at some point in our lives. A boss who takes credit for our work, a friend who constantly oversteps, or a neighbor who thinks the rules don't apply to them. It's tempting to lash out in frustration, but often calm and calculated actions have a greater impact. Instead of wasting energy on anger, focus on holding your ground, setting clear boundaries, and letting their actions expose them. If someone steals from you, document it. If someone lies about you, keep records. If someone disrespects you, show them that actions have consequences. Because at the end of the day, the best way to deal with entitled people isn't to fight them. It's to make sure they never want to mess with you again.